Welcome everyone to the NCFCA 2023 Value Resolutions Live Q&A. I have several members of the Value Resolution Debate Committee with me here this evening, and they are going to answer all of your questions. So we are very excited to discuss these proposed value resolutions. Whether you're here live or you're watching online, we welcome you, and we trust that we're going to give you some really good information that you need to decide which resolution we should debate next year. So I'll invite you to turn your camera on if you'd like, but please keep your microphone muted and use the chat box to ask your questions of the committee. I'm Christy Shipe. I'll be your host for the evening. I have been involved with NCFCA debate since the very beginning, and I've been on the debate committee for a long time. I've worked with these gentlemen here. It's been delightful to be on that committee with them. I'm also an NCFCA mom to 4 alumni competitors and 1 current competitor. And now I'd like to invite our other committee members who are here to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their background, about their connection to NCFCA, and maybe a fun fact. So Caleb, why don't we start with you?
Hi guys, so my name is Caleb Paul. I've been on the committee for a couple of years now, and before that had many years of experience in the league. So I competed for 6 years and graduated high school in 2016. So I've been around the league for a long time. I competed alongside a couple of my siblings, and then 2 of my younger siblings are still competing now from Region 9. So maybe you'll get a chance to meet some of them and the rest of my family as well, as we've been around for many years now. Yes. So when I was in the league, I did a lot of, mainly debate was my focus. I did Lincoln Douglas values debate for 4 years, and then policy debate for 2 years as well. So my fun fact is that I actually met my fiance in NCFCA at a debate tournament. So don't get any crazy ideas, not suggesting anything, but that is my fun fact.
That is fun. And the same thing is true on the policy resolution side. We had Jonathan Monroe, who also met his fiance in NCFCA.
Fantastic. Not a plug, just a statement.
It can happen. All right, Ryan, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, it's can you hear me right?
Yes.
All right, awesome. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm also an NCFCA alum. I was part of Region 9 for a couple of years. You know, it's funny too. NCFCA means a lot to me actually, because I joined Region 9 and NCFCA as an organization in the middle of high school, which is a really rough time to have to move. My dad was in the military, moved all the way from Hawaii of all places to the Eastern Seaboard. Barely knew anyone, and NCFCA was the way I got to know a whole community of people, including Caleb Paul, who's on the panel tonight. So, you know, NCFCA is awesome. I love that. I guess that's a fun fact. I grew up in Hawaii, moved across the seaboard, and joined NCFCA. So I did Lincoln Douglas for a couple of years, and that's matured a long way. I've done just about every conceivable form of public speaking you can imagine, from American Legion speech competitions to 4-H when I was like 7, to moot court at the law school level, mock trial, everything. Nowadays, I work as a telecommunications attorney in DC, but I also have a lot of fun being the head debate coach for Patrick Henry College. Some of you may know it. Patrick Henry's hosted nationals and national opens before, and it's a real treat to have all of you here tonight.
Great. It's a treat to have you here too, Ryan. We've got the debate blood flowing through all of the veins here tonight. And we are missing actually a committee member, Joel Erickson. I'm going to be talking about the white paper that he wrote. And of course, our fearless leader, Ravi Paul, he is the chair of the debate committee. He could not be here, but we're so thankful for him and all of his hard work. He is not only fantastic in the area of debate, but just one of the most godly men I know. So it's just a privilege to work with him, and write him a note and say thank you, Mr. Paul, Dr. Paul, really, for all you've done for debate. All right, so before we get to your questions, be thinking of them, start getting them ready. But first of all, I want to talk about the process of how we selected these resolutions, our top 3 for your vote. So we get emails throughout the year from you all. So that's something that you can think about for next year too. Send us your ideas. We gather all those ideas, we brainstorm amongst ourselves and we gather a whole list of value debate resolutions to consider. And then as we look at that list, we review those ideas, we research, we discuss, we debate amongst ourselves, and we look at several criteria. I'm going to go through 6 criteria that we look at to make our decision. This process goes on for several months, a good 3 or 4 months that we are working on this, and sometimes even longer. And in order to narrow it down to those top 3, we're really looking at 6 things. We're looking first and foremost at mission compatibility. We are training ambassadors for Christ. So we want to pick resolutions that Christians can debate in good conscience. That is our #1 goal every year. And so we look at every resolution through that lens. Is this something that Christians can and should debate? And then secondly, we look at the educational value. Is this going to be something that really helps students learn and grow and have great information for their future? Thirdly, we look at the relevance. So something might be educational, but not be incredibly relevant to our everyday lives. And even though value debate is about philosophy, and that can sometimes get a little in the clouds, as it were, we still do look at what is our society really talking about right now? What is relevant to our lives, not just now, but also something that we think is going to be a continuing conversation into the future, a topic that will serve you well as you graduate high school, head to college, become an adult, and contribute to our world. So something that's relevant to that future and something you're going to be glad that you studied and you know about. Then fourth, we look at the breadth of the topic. Something that covers enough ground that there's going to be a good variety of cases and something fresh and new to discuss all year long without being too broad. So we try to keep it that balance between too narrow and too broad. And then fifth, we look at supportability, which means, is there a body of literature that supports this topic? So that when you go out and start researching and reading, you're going to come across some great resources that you can use in that search. And then finally, we consider variety. We consider what are the past topics that we've had? How long has it been since we've dealt with this topic area? Can we get some brand new topic areas in there for you? So we try, and we also look amongst the 3 that we offer as our top 3, that they cover a variety of ground, that we're not just giving you 3 different versions of the same thing. So we look at all of those criteria to narrow it down to our top 3, and then we release those to you as we have just done. Each of us on the debate committee takes one of those resolutions to become the lead researcher, and we write those white papers for you. I hope you've read them. Caleb and Ryan are 2 of our authors here tonight. They're going to talk about their white papers. Like I said, Joel is not here, so I'll be covering his topic. We release those, and so you can have some background information as you consider your vote. And then that brings us to tonight. Here we are to answer your questions as you anticipate getting ready to vote. And of course, the final step is your selection. You guys will actually choose. And yes, I've been asked, do the affiliates really vote? Do we really follow the vote? Yes. Yes, we really, really do. Your vote matters. It counts. And so I hope tonight will inform you so that you can select a great topic for next year. I want to just narrow down the kind of questions that we're handling tonight. We are not going to be answering questions really about wording changes. We don't have any wording changes to talk about tonight. But if you have wording change suggestions, we would invite you to write those to us at debatecommittee@ncfca.org. And we're also not going to be answering questions about debate theory or the debate rules or anything like that. But again, if you have those questions, we would be happy to answer those for you by writing to debatecommittee@ncfca.org, and we will answer those questions via email. All right, so let me just remind you, keep the microphones muted, but please do ask your questions in the chat. Getting excited to see what questions you have. Oh, okay. Amy Joy says, Amy Joy Tofty, by the way, our Director of Education, is in the background helping us vet questions. She says there's a straw poll going on, and we're going to see if the live Q&A changes any minds after tonight. So that'll be interesting. All right, so let me get to value resolution number 1. And I'll just give you a little bit of a background on it, what the major issues are, and then open it up for your questions. So value resolution number 1. Governments have a moral obligation to recognize one or more of the following as human rights: healthcare, housing, and/or universal basic income. This is a fun one. So this is, of course, it's on the topic of human rights. And as Christians, one thing that's interesting in the literature is that a hot topic of debate is, where do human rights come from? That's a huge topic of debate right now in the world. We have that question answered, right? Because we really believe that human rights exist because they are God-given. We were made in his image. And so we have that image of God within us that gives us human rights. That is one of the popular Christian, I shouldn't speak definitively for every Christian, but I'll just say that is a popular Christian opinion on that topic. So as creator and lawgiver, he's the one who's given human beings what often we call them natural rights. And usually that's that famous list that I'm sure good value debaters have used many, many times: life, liberty, and property, right? Most people in the world agree. We have the rights to life, liberty, and property. But when we get to these other rights, healthcare, housing, universal basic income, that's where it gets more debatable. I just want to anticipate a question about, well, can a Christian support the use of the term human rights to apply it to something like housing and healthcare and universal basic income? And I would say yes. And the way that most Christians see that connection is that they start with, let's say, the right to life. We have the right to life given to us by God. And then we say, but what do we need in order to live that life? Your life can be very difficult or even in jeopardy if you don't have housing, for example, if you don't have access to income. And, this is a technical term, universal basic income, so we can debate about that, if people have a right to that exactly. But we can agree, in our world today, it's hard to have a thriving life without an income of some kind. Healthcare as well. If we have no access to healthcare whatsoever, then what kind of life is that going to be? So as you can just see, my very simple reasoning process is connecting some of those natural rights, those foundational rights, if you want to call them first level rights or whatever, starting there and then reasoning from there up to these secondary rights. One thing you'll see in the literature is that the human rights we all agree on, the foundational ones, the fundamental ones, the life, liberty, and property, those are universal, but they're also very vague. And they apply to all people of all times. But in our modern context and culture, philosophers and thinkers and even governing bodies, especially the UN and the EU and things like that, are now looking more at specific and more specific rights that flow out of those more general universal rights, and applying it into contexts where most people need a job to survive, most people need healthcare and can expect healthcare. So you can look at it that way. Some of the sources I would point you to they're mentioned in the white paper. So really, I would point you to the white paper. Go dig into those sources. There's a whole list there. There's also I love the Stanford University's philosophy encyclopedia. So it's stanford.plato.edu. And oh my goodness, if you go into their human rights article, they've got a ton of sources and people in there. Something to look at from a legal perspective on human rights and what people are naming as human rights today: course, you can start with something great like the Declaration of Independence, but also the Universal Declaration on Human Rights from the UN, the European Social Charter. There's the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. That's the type of rights that are listed in this resolution. So not civic rights or political rights, but economic, social, and cultural. And there's an international covenant on that. So you can look at that. There's the Vienna Declaration. So there's a lot of literature on this issue. The discussion of human rights is vast and ongoing. Let me also deal with a question that I anticipate you are asking. Why 3, right? Why do we have these 3 choices? Well, we wanted to do something fun. And we are actually really excited about the idea that you could have 3 unique cases on affirmative and you could decide which one you want to run in which round. That's something that happens a lot in policy debate. And it's something that policy debaters handle all the time. And it's something that I know you on the value debate side can handle with ease. And I think it will be really fun and exciting to explore that. It will give you more variety through the season, and it'll allow you to have some different strategies. Now, if you want to run the case, I think you can clearly see this from the wording. If you want to run a case that is about all 3, you can. Or you can run a case that's just about one. And it allows you to explore each of those areas and decide which one do you think has the most support as a moral obligation for governments to declare or to recognize, more specifically, it says to recognize as a human right. So let me get to some of your questions now. Let's see. Chad asks, because this topic hits political issues such as healthcare and income, would you find a judge's ballot can be based on their political belief? And by the way, I'll invite Ryan and Caleb to jump in at any time. Yes, political belief does always impact a judge's decision. I mean, in any case, right? So I don't think that that's unique to this resolution. I guess we could ask whether or not this one in particular highlights it in a special way. But I don't think so. I don't think so. And I would further add, don't shy away from those topics where people have different opinions based on politics, because this is a skill we need to learn. We need to learn how to persuade people of all political backgrounds. I know it's a challenge, but it's the real world. That's where we're at. And I would also say the affirmative has multiple options here, like I mentioned, and can decide which one they think is the most appealing to the most judges. I don't know if Caleb or Ryan have anything to add to that.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a good question, and I'm really excited about the answer to that because a couple of things. One is I think the answer to that question is definitely yes. You can have politically motivated judges, as you can have politically motivated people in society. But one of the key things that I love about Lincoln Douglas is that if you want a more advanced conversation surrounding things like politics and society, one of the ways to do that is to engage in philosophical values debate. And so in some sense, you could say that philosophy and value debate precedes politics in a more rational discussion. And so it's a really good opportunity to engage yourself on these topics. As a former competitor, I understand it can be sometimes frustrating when you feel like maybe the judge was biased. Maybe you're right, maybe you're not. So that can be frustrating, but that's going to be any topic. But on a political topic in value debate, you have the opportunity to engage yourself with the things that, as Christy was saying, you're gonna see in reality with people that you know.
That's right. And that's a really great point, Caleb, that these value questions actually precede the policy questions. And so hopefully people are arriving at their politics because they believe something in a principled way, or like a moral, right? From a moral standpoint, like this resolution says, a moral obligation. So I think this debate is going to center on that moral obligation and whether or not these things are actually human rights. Catherine asked the question, would this resolution lead into a sort of policy debate over the outflow from government recognition. It could a little bit, but again, like we were just talking about, this is about whether or not governments have a moral obligation to recognize these kinds of things as human rights. Now, one of the arguments that's definitely in the literature is about, can you have a moral obligation that you can't meet? But that is a philosophical conversation, and that is well within the grounds of this resolution. So of course, anyone can try to take it into policy area, but I don't think you need to at all. And yet you can talk about whether or not governments are able to meet these obligations as a precursor to whether or not they have these moral obligations. Let me go to Jedediah. Oh, go ahead, Ryan, add to that. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to add on that, and actually I was previewing Jedediah's question too, because I think this one and Jedediah's question harmonize pretty well concerning how does the involvement of the government really relate to this category of topic. And, you know, with the notion of the government being the limited actor, and the previous conversation we just had with Caleb and Christy about how these values conversations really precede the political question and any bias there. Much of that is because if the values question is true on the affirmative, and that there is some incorporation of these, what we'll call political nomenclature rights, into the right to life, that universal basic income, housing, healthcare is part of the right to life, then we wanted to limit it to the government because the government is the actor in position and perhaps bound by a social contract to fight for that right to life for its citizens. If we expanded it, say, for example, to any and all individuals and persons, then we start to get into really nuanced questions of, well, is this nonprofit doing a good job? Or if I on the streets am not giving of all of my money, cash, and my roof and all my guest bedrooms to someone, am I also forsaking that right? And in order to protect kind of the narrowness of the round and limit it to the values and what is the scope of the value of life? And what is the responsibility of a sovereign? Right, the word sovereign itself is a huge part of the literature on this and goes into a number of topics that we're talking about tonight, right? You can look at a whole history of that. And so I think limiting it to that government actor is limiting it to someone with authority and even biblical recognition, a legitimate government and a legitimate authority, I think imports a lot with our mission and what we're talking about here. So hopefully that sort of speaks to that question a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Ryan. Yes, I think it does. And the literature that I've come across too often does speak of human rights in the context of government actors. So I think you'll find that to be a really rich area of research for you. Matthew asks, could you run a subset of 2 under this resolution? Absolutely, yes. So if you wanted to, because it says and or, yes, you could combine, you could do just 1, you could do all 3, or you could combine any 2. Absolutely. So a lot of variety there. Julia's question is, I assume basic income would still be given to someone who refuses to work, even if they are completely capable of working. That is something I think that you'll have to research and discuss as part of the debate. What does that mean? Who does it apply to? The literature will be discussing that type of thing. So that's one of the questions that you will seek to find out and answer. I don't know if Caleb or Ryan, do you have any background on universal basic income as a right?
Yeah, I'll add that the definitional question is not just who does it apply to as far as a definitional purpose, but we're sort of an LD crowd here. Who should it apply to, right? Who does the government have the moral obligation to support in its notion? Those in a particular workforce, is that different from disability pay? Is that different from Social Security, sort of a net for those at a certain age where the government gives back and protects those persons? I think a lot of that comes into the moral obligation question. Who is the government as part of that life protection mandated or morally obligated to protect and preserve? And so your definition could be a run-of-the-mill, Times edition that's in the political spectrum these days, or you could try to tie it very specifically to the moral intuition of who is the government responsible for caretaking. And I think that's a big part of where you should go with it.
Right, thank you.
And
Caleb,
I'll add to that as well. So in the question, you also say, even if someone is capable of working, which is also sometimes a subjective question, not only because of, okay, what defines capability when there's a lot of different type of work, but also what determines the value of work. Is all, work of equal value and things of that nature as well. And so that's another value to a topic like this, is that it gets us to think through those things, as Christy was saying, to read up on these, read the literature, and figure out what people are saying about this in general, but also to examine your own biases about certain things, what it means to be capable of working, what it means to refuse to work, what it means to, as we spoke about earlier, what that basic income should be and who should it apply to. So it's taking some concepts from experts and people who have thought a lot about this, and then applying it also to modern times and to your own views as well, to challenge yourself and to come up with stronger views yourself.
Great. Let me ask both of you to answer this question. Do you think this is a relevant resolution? How relevant is this to our lives today?
I mean, I'm not sure you can get any more relevant than the very question of how a government is to protect the lives of its person. I mean, you look at the issues of homelessness, for example, healthcare issues, medical prices. I hosted an entire debate tournament this weekend collegiately, for example, on questions of pricing for medication. And there's entire organizations devoted to the fact in the healthcare spectrum that people are dying because they can't afford medication. And so as far as it being relevant, this is a question that people literally live or die over, whether it be housing, whether it be healthcare, whether it be the fact that there's inability to find work in the society. So how a government is going to be able to resolve those questions, and which of those questions morally they should have to resolve, in particular for the LD debate, is critical. It'll help you cut through the noise that you hear, because you'll know, hey, regardless of what is being asked of the government, I've done the research, I've read the literature, I'm confident in that these are the things government should be responsible for covering. And I think that'll tremendously help you to blur out a lot of the issues that threaten to overwhelm in today's political culture.
Great. Excellent. Caleb, let me ask you this question that just came in from Lisa. Does this resolution assume a government actor for both sides? So could the neg argue that there's no moral obligation for governments to recognize these as human rights, but there is an individual obligation or from others to do so? Would that be outside the resolution?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say, as far as the actor, I would say that the government is kind of stated as the actor for the affirmative statement of the resolution, as it's worded there. But to your point, I think that's absolutely a legitimate argument for a negative to make. So the government is the focus of the round, but that argument for the negative, since it's opposing that resolution, can very easily be, no, the government doesn't have this obligation. And you can go about that either by saying that obligation doesn't exist at all, or you can go about it by arguing that somebody else has that obligation, whether that be a religious group or just a social group or a community or something like that. So it's within the bounds, it's not the actor per se, but it's certainly relevant to the topic, and I think very important to the topic, even related to the relevance, as Ryan was just talking about.
Yes, I agree. I totally agree. Here's an important question from Macy, and this is something that we talk about every year. She says, we are not allowed to mention God in our debates, right? And someone else says, well, I don't know, but I think we're not allowed to in TP. Let me clarify on this. There is no rule. There is no NCFCA rule that says you can't mention God in the debate round. All right, so that is not a rule whatsoever. We want you to approach all of your debates from a Christian worldview, from first studying the Bible and God's word and knowing him well, and then from there, looking at what man has to say. We always want to start with what God has to say. So a mistake that our world has made is just relying on man and our own intellects and not on the Lord. So we want you going to the Lord first. Now, where it gets tricky is when debaters put an opponent in a position where I'm using God against you, where I'm saying God agrees with me. And if you don't vote for me, you're voting against God in the Bible. That's what we discourage. So, for example, I think you could make a point in this debate to agree with your opponent. Do we agree that human rights come from God? And that could be a question that you ask and get agreement on. And you could start from there as a foundation, as a common point of agreement. But then what we want to warn you against is to use the mentioning of God or scripture in any way to make your opponent feel like you're saying God is on my side and he's not on your side, and the vote for God is the vote for me. So that is what we want to warn you against. Really important question. All right, let's move on to value resolution number 2. And this is a really good one. Ryan, you wrote the white paper on this, so I will come to you. Let me just read the resolution. Resolved, physical violence is a just response to political oppression. Now, let me start with the question, what's one of the most central value conflicts in this resolution?
Yeah, I thank you for that, Christy. This is probably one of, if not the most timely resolution you can imagine. I mean, the world is engulfed in questions of how do you respond to feeling powerless in society? Is violent protest acceptable? Is that morally legitimate under any rubric of philosophical backing, right? And so I think people are tempted to get caught up in the articles, columnists and political thinkers publishing about this, when really I think there's something at the core. And there's this dichotomy, we mentioned it earlier, life, liberty, and property, right? Sort of the trio, the trinity of value rights that everyone knows in Lincoln Douglas. And realistically, this pits them against each other. You've got this core question of, if only my liberty is compromised, or if only my property is compromised, political oppression, right? Those are being robbed from me. Is striking out against life acceptable? And so rather than just casually accepting life, liberty, and property as sort of co-equal rights, where we all bring them in together, finally, this is a topic, I think, that allows you to break the noise and say, let's have a real conversation about whether or not one is superior. I think in modern society, we've sort of become genteel to the notion that life is the predominant force, nonviolent resistance. There's a real strong movement there that no, you can't do anything that damages property, that hurts life, if you're only being politically oppressed, because life is the superior of the three. And this calls that into philosophical question to say, there's a real debate happening with political protest and violent resistance. Maybe do we bring life back down as a co-equal to liberty and property? So I see that as really one of the core things with this topic. And while it's timely and people can get really wrapped up in the protest issue, I think as a values topic, it is exceptionally interesting. And there's so much literature that cuts a lot of different ways. And you might find pulling yourself from scholars and thinkers from topics of eons past into this, just because it has relevance to that Lockean and Jeffersonian notion of life, liberty, and property, or the pursuit of happiness.
Right. Excellent. Yes, I think the body of literature here is vast and goes back through history. We have a question from Catherine. How would one avoid going into a nitty-gritty definitions debate concerning the meaning of political oppression?
Sure, I think that's a great question. I think, and I propose that the topic really bifurcates that for you. It sets apart physical violence and political oppression. The use of the word physical and the use of the limiting word political spreads the two apart, indicating that if there is violent oppression, whether it be through, say, for example, abuse, police firing into crowds, Tiananmen Square sort of situations, that sort of separates it from sheer and mere political oppression, that's a violent action that might merit, under any proportionality of response argument, a violent response. And so if you're looking at a society that is simply oppressed politically with their rights, or predominantly, I mean, those usually go hand in hand. There's always a situation where there are outlying instances of violence in a politically oppressed state. Any totalitarian regime will have that response. But looking at the whole, if the scheme itself is political oppression, can you have that response? To quote from our Declaration of Independence, a long train of abuses Legitimizing a response, for example, by separation and starting of a war for independence is a violent action of independent war, a legitimate response to a long train of taxation, lack of hearing voices, religious oppression, etc. I mean, it's very much resurging and regurgitating the question of independence in the United States as well in the 1700s. So hopefully the phrasing of the topic will bifurcate that for you.
Okay, great. And Chad asked, why did we decide to use political oppression for this resolution? I guess as opposed to just oppression in general.
Sure. Because we wanted to make the debate a little bit more equal. I think there's almost universal agreement in literature that violent oppression generally is a war-starting action for many respects. And you'll find even the most pacifist thinkers, with some exception, Mahatma Gandhi, for example. And by the way, if you're looking for resources on this, I'm going to throw out Gene Sharp. As he's actually commonly referred to as the Machiavelli of nonviolent resistance in public literature. Everything from Thoreau to Gandhi to Nelson Mandela's analysis. I mean, everything's included in Sharp's works. And ultimately, sort of a understanding for proportionality. If people are getting slaughtered by government, any sort of mass killings or abuses, there's going to be cries for response. So this again brings it to a values debate. Is life equal or co-equal or more important or less important than just property and just liberty? That's really the core of what we're trying to debate.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Thatcher asks a very important question, one that we discussed as a committee. Does affirmative have to prove this resolution true in all situations or just in most situations?
Not at all. I think this is actually part of the literature, by the way, and why I really think this is a scholarship-rich subject that is rich both in theory and practical example. And so this is where you're going to have this debate. You're going to supplement this with really rich examples. For example, Zsolt Kaplan, Central European University, phenomenal thinker looking at proportionality of response. He actually delineates sort of as an extension of old just war theory, asymmetric application of this to a people that are oppressed. Can they wage just war against an illegitimate oppressive regime? And he talks about the differences between what he calls vital and non-vital rights, for example, mainly in the realm of liberty, what some people would call political and non-political liberties, voting versus the right to own a house, sheer property rights. And there are a variety of sliding scale examples of where perhaps violent resistance is justified if all voting and all representation is taken away, but not if only voting is taken away, but the right to peaceably assemble is not. I mean, it again goes very granularly into the hierarchy of how do these rights relate to one another. And so you've got thinkers like Kaplan that talk about that proportionality of response. You have thinkers, even for example, like Alan Weiner at Stanford, who's publishing articles on the asymmetric application of Augustinian just war theory and applying that even from the Salamanca school back in the 1700s, now to say actually there's a near universal right. So I think it's the affirmative. You get a pretty broad choice. You get to say yes in all cases if you really want to. You might be making it a little hard on yourself because that's controversial in literature, but there's sources out there that'll back you on it. Or you could take a more moderated approach and say, I don't think it's acceptable in all instances. I don't think rooting and rioting is an example to make a point here, but maybe sometimes it is. Even MLK recognized that with racial riots in the US 60s. And so there's a lot of thought to it, but you guys get that choice.
That's right. Yes. And just to reinforce what Ryan said, the literature on debate theory says that the burden on affirmative is really just to prove the resolution true in the majority of cases. So you can think of it as 50% plus one, right? That's the burden. So yeah, if you want to defend it in all situations, feel free. But I think it's great that that particular question is asked and answered in the literature as well.
Right. It's what we lawyer types like to call preponderance. And
right,
it's basically there in the literature built in. Every source you're going to read is going to talk about that very question.
Great.
If I can add,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can just add briefly to that, I think it's worth noting as well that just to continue to clarify that when we're talking about when Ryan's mentioning that this can be that there's literature on maybe certain contexts where violence is appropriate or violent reactions are appropriate. It's not that you pick and choose examples and that you make the case based off of that. It's that you are
Yes.
taking an overall philosophy, a set of philosophies, and then you're proposing a criteria by which you would filter out, okay, because of this thing, this certain situation may be appropriate and the other one might not be. And so I think this resolution leans very heavily on criterion. As a way of, because as Ryan pointed out, you're talking about political oppression versus physical violence. And so those two things, you can't just default to a utilitarian, well, this one costs more lives kind of approach. And I think that's really cool. So it's not just, well, this scenario looks worse than that one, so let's go for this side, but it's based on a philosophical criteria for, okay, why is it appropriate in one situation, not the other?
That's right. You're advocating for a standard or a rule. And the examples just illustrate that standard or that rule that can be applied in the majority of cases. I want to get to one more question on this, and then we'll move to the third topic. We have the question, can political oppression lead to physical harm? Or does the fact that physical harm is involved mean it's no longer political?
Yeah, thank you. This is a fascinating question, and in fact, it's baked into some of the literature again, which is why I love this topic, because you really are breaking down all these questions are premeditated, the very things you're going to read. Political oppression can and often does, if not nearly always does, lead to violent response or violent action by the oppressor. One of those two things will happen. Nelson Mandela talked about this in response to apartheid, and why at the end of his days, he was not surprised that violent response existed. And yet why, even at the end of his days, after 40, 50 years being an advocate of nonviolence, at the end of his days said, you know what, we should have chose violence as a response, because part of the calculus in saying that violent response to political oppression is acceptable is because violent oppression is going to happen eventually. And so it's a premeditated action. You guys might be familiar with some of those topics from this year, right? Preemptive advocates, like preemptive wars, preemptive strikes. And this is baked into just war theory in the question, can you in advance strike out against someone who will very quickly oppress you? So some of the literature about this actually discusses whether or not violent response to political oppression is acceptable only through assassinations, for example, very minuscule things to prevent persons from becoming violent in the future, right? With that being acceptable, proportionality of response, that's a big part of this. So the very fact that political oppression does often generate violent response in the future, that's part of this topic, right? Saying, look, let's go ahead and get these guys out of power in a violent method before things get worse than they have to. Very much what happened in the Haitian Revolution, where you had an entire society subjected to slavery and became essentially the first successful slave result to take control of an entire nation state at that time and become a legitimate governing authority before more slaves basically lost any further rights to life in that period. Now, the fact that physical harm is involved means it no longer political. I don't think so entirely, for one reason that I mentioned earlier, that no full-on movement is immune from outlying examples. So the fact that a movement is predominantly nonviolent, but has a couple of instances that turned violent, doesn't necessarily make it a nonviolent, or doesn't necessarily suddenly make it a violent movement. Or the fact that a government is politically oppressive, occasionally had a couple of outbursts that hurt people, does that fully make it outside the scope of the resolution? I don't think so, because anytime people with really heated opinions get together, rally, things get violent occasionally and nearly unavoidably. And so I think you're looking at the scope and overarching idea of what governments were just totalitarian states that didn't really kill a lot of people initially, but that focused on burdening their life and their property in some way without any sort of murderous stain to them. And that's the question of when can we strike back? And so this whole question that you're asking is so very keen to the topic that I can't wait to see how you all address it, because that's kind of what we want you to address.
Absolutely. And I just add, I think because political oppression happens by the government or by whether legitimate or illegitimate, right? It always carries behind it that power of the sword, right? The state always has that power of force. So that's always present in political oppression. at least in the background, if not in the foreground. All right, let's go to value resolution number 3. This is another classic. Resolved, the individual right to property ought to be valued above the economic interest of the community. I really love this resolution as well. And we're going to turn to Caleb, who studied this topic for us. Caleb, what's at stake in this resolution?
Oh man, there's a lot at stake in this resolution. I love this topic. I've always loved this topic. It's an extremely relevant topic for all time, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. But when I think about this resolution and from the research that I did, I think that you kind of have to run into two principles that are very important to pretty much everyone, and that is one, that theft is not a good thing. If somebody has property, if someone holds something to be their own and it's taken from them, it's kind of a pretty universal, almost without any argument whatsoever, not a good thing to have that taken for a variety of reasons, political, moral, even psychological. We know that this is true. On the other hand, we know that poverty exists. We know that there always have been and continue to be people in the world, many of them, who don't have access to the things that they need to survive or have a high quality of life. And we know that that is also a bad thing. And so you are presented with this very sort of critical issue where you have two things and you don't want to violate the first one. You don't want to take someone's property, but you also don't want to see people without resources. And so just right off the bat, the moment you get into the topic, you're into something that's very important for any person at any time, that really is life or death for people on both sides. So I think it's a very high stakes kind of topic, which is very interesting.
Yes, for sure. And it presents, like you're saying, a very interesting values clash right from the get-go. Matthew asked this question: how can LD debaters avoid getting stuck in the muck of defining economic interest or property with this resolution?
That's a good question. Yeah, so from my perspective, I think property is not going to have a huge issue with that. There are specific distinctions maybe on the type of property, whether something, especially in this kind of modern age, when you're talking about things like cryptocurrency and all of that, then things start to get a little bit more complicated. But for the most part, there's a very consistent literature definition of property. So I wouldn't be too worried about that. As far as economic interest, I think there is a lot of definition debate, but I think that's a good thing for the topic, because economic interest is a very, very questionable and debatable principle on purpose, because even, for instance, a person in this country is going to have a very different approach to that topic as someone from another country, or even the same country from 50 years ago or 100 years ago, because economic interest really has a very large spectrum, whether that's just surviving, whether that's building wealth, whether that's creating a large economy to maybe produce something else, or to affect national security or something like this. So there's a lot to be discussed there, but I don't think that's something we want to steer away from.
Absolutely. Let me just reinforce that and say, I think debates over definitions are incredibly important. And I'll just reference apologetics as an area that you might be familiar with in NCFCA if you've competed. A lot of those questions are just definitional, but they are vital for you to understand how to define your faith and what you believe. So definitions are very important. How do you keep it from getting stuck in the muck? You find really good sources, really reputable sources for your definitions, and then you explain the reasoning behind it. And you explain why your definition is important, why it's to be preferred to your opponents. So stuck in the muck to me could be like, well, I have this definition, well, I have this other one. And nobody is explaining the reasoning behind it, or why it's important, or how it interacts with the other person. Because if you do all of that, you can have some really rich LD rounds on definitions. I mean, not just only definitions, but defining the grounds of the resolution is a really important part of LD debate. So don't shy away from it. Just learn to do it well. All right. Let's see. I don't see new questions here. So let me just ask you, Caleb, just talk a little bit from the affirmative perspective of this resolution, how you might start thinking of approaching it, and then the negative side.
Yeah, so from the affirmative side, in favor of the right to property over the economic interests of the community, there's a lot of very interesting arguments to be made, and again, I would point you to the white paper and some of these resources. There's a couple of different, very fascinating ways that people are able to argue in favor of the right to property. One of the most famous is by John Locke, who essentially argued that as you put your labor, you put your essentially yourself. He defines it almost as if you're putting part of your life into something by putting your labor into it, putting your resources into it. Then you are essentially claiming that out of the state of nature, the neutral state maybe that that resources are in. And as you put your mark on that, so to speak, then you start to lay claim to that. And as soon as that happens, your individuality is tied to the things that you've earned. So you can all kind of understand that maybe more practically if you think of, if you're working at a job and you've put your labor into something, you're given money for that. And if someone decides all of a sudden, well, actually, I think that I deserve that just as much as you because I'm in the same world as the place that you work. If someone told me about that in my work, I'd be a little bit offended by that because yes, that resource of what I work on is in the same world as them, but I'm the one who actually put something into that to get something out of it. So that's one of the kind of core principles. There are other ways of looking at it as well. From the negative side, there's kind of the opposite approach where you have to realize that in the default, in the state of just fundamental nature, no resource belonged to a person at the beginning, at least not as far as we can trace back, right? So at some point, someone made the very arbitrary decision that yes, this land belongs to me. That tree and the fruit on it belongs to me. And all of that trickles down throughout the generations. And all of a sudden that means that when I go to work and work on a system as a manufacturing engineer, that means that I deserve X amount of money. And so there's a fundamentally arbitrary nature to the whole issue of property. And so when you consider all of the resources in the entire world as essentially belonging to everyone from that philosophical perspective, then it becomes a little bit more gray as to, okay, why does this belong to you? Because one of somebody's ancestor, millennia ago decided that they own this peach tree. So it does get a little bit complicated, but I think those are the places that I would start to think about researching this topic.
That's really helpful.
I'd love to jump on it with an
Yeah,
extra
go ahead.
question for Caleb
Yes.
too. We've been talking about some of these other topics with the flashpoints in society where these debates are really being played out.
Yes.
As far as connecting this to what the students might be observing nowadays and what might be relevant in their classrooms and in their homes and amongst their peers, where do you see this debate playing out the most, and what might intrigue them about how they could find answers to the questions they're seeing as a result of debating this topic?
That's exactly the question I was just going to ask. Where do we see this conflict in our world today, Caleb?
Hey, perfect.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that so the more obvious way that we see this topic is kind of like the resolution one. It's a very politically motivated topic in some sense, where we see things like policies for wealth redistribution, even things like universal basic income or healthcare or stuff like that. So it's very relevant in those situations. So taxation is probably the most classic example of this kind of debate, where you're saying that the government fundamentally can say, yes, I know you own this, but I'm going to take some of it for the good of the community. And it's something that we're all pretty okay with for the most part, and most of the literature would agree. But there's always that question of, okay, why and how much and what should it go to? And so that's a lot of the topic here. And that has become increasingly relevant, I would say, in the last couple of decades as the debates about things like wealth redistribution become more important. But then the other thing I would point you to, just as a matter of interest, is I would argue that this topic is probably more relevant in today's day and age than it ever has been before, because of the connectivity globally throughout the world. And so, because I would say that, as a engineer living on the East Coast of the United States, I have more impact financially and just from a property perspective on people throughout the world than I would have if I lived in any other day and age. And so it becomes an even more relevant topic when it is potentially feasible that something that belongs to me now could someday belong to someone in, an island in the Pacific. It becomes just a broader debate and something that I think is more important as you have more connectivity between people from all walks of life, as opposed to maybe one small community.
Right, absolutely. And I love, as you pointed out in your white paper, that this question has roots all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, who actually disagreed on it. So it's one of those foundational questions to the way we operate as a society that has been there ever since societies have existed and continues to be a question in our day. So I think this is a fantastic topic. All right, well, we are almost out of time, so I'll just ask for maybe one or two final questions on any of the resolutions we've talked about tonight. Human rights, we've got political oppression and is violence justified in response to that? And of course, the individual versus the community. How do we weigh that out? Any other questions about those topics? While you're thinking, I will remind you that you can vote. And where do you go to vote? Well, go to your NCFCA dashboard, and there's a blue bar at the top of the screen. You're going to click on the survey there, and that is going to be your ballot. The ballot has ranked voting, so be sure to put your resolutions in order. What's your first favorite, second, and third by midnight on April 18th. So you've still got another week to think about it and weigh the options. And you can look for the recordings of these live Q&A sessions and share them with your friends, discuss amongst your clubs, discuss in your family. So we're really interested to see what you choose for next year. Seeing that there's no further questions, I just will thank you all for coming tonight. I've had a great time meeting with you, talking with Caleb and Ryan, and we thank Joel and Robbie, who also couldn't be here. Thank you, though, Caleb and Ryan, for giving us your time, your effort on this, all your research. We benefit from your wisdom and your hard work. You've been so generous. We really appreciate it. We appreciate all of you being here. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope this has helped you decide what topic you'd like to choose to debate next year. Thank you so much, and good night.